This episode is brought to you by Monkey Nutrition. You mentioned briefly the Cuban Missile Crisis,
right.
And I guess that's a very obvious point where Russian and American relations came together. And I was wondering if you could tell me if you remember personally what it was like being in America at that time. And I've watched the documentary called The Fog of War, which I'm sure you have watched, which John McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time with John F. Kennedy, talked about what was happening in those days. And later he recalls going to see Castro in Cuba, as you mentioned, and realizing that they were actually armed missiles that with also the capacity to fire locally, which was flabbergasting to him. And then apparently Castro even said, and I would have fired them as well if you would have attacked Cuba. And so one thing McNamara says is that that's just way too close for humans to become. But can I get your thoughts on what it was like to go through that, and then what your thoughts were, well, I guess on the movie and McNamara's comments?
Yeah. Well, John Kennedy is at the centerpiece here. When he came into office, the first thing that confronted him was a very foolish operation run by the CIA called the Bay of Pigs.
Right.
That was April 1961.
61, and he came into office in 60, or?
Right,
Okay.
January.
So it had already been in play.
Yeah, Eisenhower had sort of approved it, but he was a short timer. Kennedy looked at this thing and he said, "My God, the bunch of ragtag emigres are going to take over. Oh yeah, they're ripe for revolution. They're ripe for I knew counter-revolution really is what they're ripe for,
Right.
And we got it all figured out." So Kennedy says very, very seriously to them, he says, "Look, this doesn't sound like it's a great idea to me, but if Eisenhower approved it, just realize that if you get in trouble on the beach, no U.S. Air Force, no U.S. Army, no U.S. Navy is going to be involved in invading a sovereign country." Okay.
Right. Too chancy, just a bad idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Allen Dulles and Bissell, one of his assistants, who had no real military experience, went ahead in the full expectation that when, as would inevitably happen, those guys got pinned down on the beach, the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Army, everybody else would help out because the president couldn't possibly just leave them there, right? Okay. Now we know that because when Dulles died, he left some coffee-stained notes which said, "The president's not going to be able to avoid giving us the help we're going to need." So, it's not McGovern speculating about this. That's was the plan.
Well, he had indicated to the military leaders that they would have some backup.
Yeah, well, the military was just as what's the word, crazy to prevent any communists and to defeat Castro, who was such a threat to our hemisphere and so forth, and give the Soviets a bloody nose. So it was Allen Dulles with the military, but John Kennedy was the commander-in-chief, and he made it very clear, no U.S. forces. Right. So they do it anyway. They get trouble on the beach, the debacle that happened there,
yeah.
And they come to Kennedy and say, "Well, can you help?" He said, "No, I told you, I'm not going to do it." So he knew he had been mousetrapped, right?
Right.
I mean, he's a bright guy, okay? And so he cans Allen Dulles, who, sort of one of the muckety-mucks, as my Irish grandmother would call him, kind of the upper crust there. He and his brother, John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State, they're pretty much running the foreign policy of our country. And you don't can people like that, no matter how egregious the mistakes they make. So what happened was later, when Khrushchev sort of took the measure of Kennedy, they met in Vienna the next spring, and he saw this young fellow that he might be able to take advantage of. Castro was wanting this kind of support, and so Khrushchev decided to put offensive missiles in Cuba. And Kennedy had said, "This is going to be crossing a line, you can't do this," but he did it anyway, okay? Now, Kennedy's faced with this incredible problem. The Joint Chiefs want to obliterate Cuba, and they want to kill everybody they can in the Soviet Union. And Kennedy says to them, "Well, how many Americans would die if we do that?" And they said, "Well, only about 30 to 40 million."
Because of the nuclear strike, right?
Yeah. And Kennedy leaves the room. He says, "These guys are crazy."
And the population was probably 150 at that point,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. So so that's how close they came. Now,
And McNamara alluded that in the film that the military was just, they still wanted to go in. Even after the crisis was diffused, they still wanted to go in and crush Cuba.
Great chance, yeah.
Right, okay.
So it was really, it was really nip and tuck there. And with this great military pressure for, doing something about this, Kennedy was, I remember, you asked me where I was waiting to be called onto active duty. November 2nd was when I reported on active duty. So around this time, I had just finished teaching. I was getting ready to go in the Army, and all this was happening. And so what Kennedy did, he did a very, very measured thing, and Bobby Kennedy, his brother, helped him. They talked with Dobrynin, they talked with KGB people, and they talked, most important, with Llewellyn Thompson, who had been our ambassador in Moscow and knew the Russians. Okay,
right, and he knew the Russians he knew one of them quite intimately. He'd been to his house. Who was
Khrushchev.
Right. Oh, Khrushchev. Okay,
Yeah.
right.
So Kennedy had the foresight to always make sure that Llewellyn Thompson was there. Right. So at one point, if I recall correctly, they're just about to launch. They're just about to do something really foolish when Llewellyn Thompson says, "Well, look, I think there's a way out of here." And Kennedy says, "What?" And they said, "I think," Kennedy had said, "What's wrong with this plan?" And Thompson said, "Well, look, here's what you have. You have two messages from Khrushchev, right? One says something pretty conciliatory. We can maybe work this out. You're going to have to give some, maybe the missiles in Turkey. And the other one, I imagine, was written with the military breathing down his back, which says, under no conditions will we pull those missiles out. So what you do, Mr. President, with all due respect, is you answer the first one.
Right. And ignore the second one.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so with Bobby Kennedy talking with Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador at the time, and Kennedy answering in this way, they worked it out. And, the implicit thing that wasn't revealed at the time was we were going to take those missiles that we had in Turkey out of there. Okay?
Right.
Of course, we didn't need them there anyway. It's lots of other stuff. So the point is that the war was avoided. Now, when you get finished with a traumatic event like that, if you have any sense at all, you say, not only, but you say, my God, how do we prevent things from reaching that point again? And Kennedy and Khrushchev developed a relationship by talking to each other and by exchanging on the hotline and other means, you can imagine what those are, that the military was cut out of. And some of the CIA guys were cut out of it too.
Okay.
And before you know it, Kennedy is making incredible speeches like the one at the American University, which he says, we should have complete disarmament. This is crazy. We should not have these nuclear weapons, And he's talking not only with Khrushchev, he's talking with Castro behind everybody's back through a friend of his who was a journalist, okay? Now, military CIA has ways of finding out all about this. And worst of all, from their point of view, he's going to leave Vietnam, and all of Southeast Asia is going to go to the, who?
Russia.
Commies, right? Okay, well, it's the Russians or the Chinese. We weren't really, they're all commies, right?
Right.
He had issued 2 executive orders, okay, in October of the year they killed him, and November was 63. So in October 63, the first one said that we're going to pull out 1,000 troops by the end of this year, 63, from Vietnam, and the rest of them, second order, the rest of them by the end of 65, okay? The bulk of the rest of them, we leave a couple in. Now, that speaks volumes about what Kennedy was going to do, what we could have avoided. But it also speaks volumes about how these troglodytes, same guys that wanted to, obliterate the Soviet Union, and we only take 30 to 40 million casualties, Right. And so, in my view, the Allen Dulleses of this world, Allen himself at the lead, the military that thought they were rescuing the country from somebody too weak vis-a-vis the communists, did John Kennedy in. And I say that advisedly. I say that mostly on the basis of the best book available on this. It's called JFK and the Unspeakable. It's a very persuasive case.
This week on London Real, former MI5 intelligence officer turned whistleblower, Annie Machon.
What we're looking at now is a de facto police state. You know, all the laws are in place, they're just not being applied to most citizens yet. I think it's not a case of having anything to hide, it's having a case that I have a right to privacy, and I can't guarantee my government will uphold that right, therefore I need to take the steps to do it.
She talks NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden.
He would die for his country. He wants to try and improve the way his country operates within its own boundaries and protect its citizens. And we seem to forget and think that human rights are a luxury. They're not, they're fundamental, and privacy is one of them.
On Sunday, London Real presents Annie Machon, whistleblower.
So it's a very British mess, is the short answer.